the DRS situation. Okay, so let me flip over here to the DRS slide. There it is. And my DRS picture here shows you, all right, I've got 2 hosts here because it's just easier to see than with 3. But it can be up to a very large number of hosts. And I've got one host that's overloaded. Okay, I got, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 servers on there. That's a lot of servers to have on one host. The other host has only got, what, 5. So the other half of my VMware cluster is to take one or more of the machines and then move them over to the underloaded hosts to balance the resource use across all the hosts in the cluster. Simple stuff. Now, when I turn on these functions, obviously I have to have licensing for them. I also have to have really an awareness of how much hardware is available so that the cluster can support the needs that I want to have. And if I only have 2 hosts in my cluster, there's not that many places for the virtual machines to go. And so when you're building clusters, you got to kind of pay attention to what amount of hardware you're going to apply into that cluster. And here's my picture. I got 4 hosts. In order for a cluster to have the resources available to support the failover needs of a lost host, I need to have, and this is a sort of introductory statement, I need to have at least 1 host's worth of available resources that are left as unused to support the loss of a host. Okay, now let's think about this. So this is, each one of these 3 is a host that's running at 100% capacity, kind of extreme example here. Let's assume all 4, if this host fails and it's also running at 100% capacity, well, there's nowhere for the virtual machines to go. The other hosts are operating at 100% capacity, so if I move the virtual machines off of that failed host onto the other hosts, well, I got a problem, right? When you're building a cluster, it is important for you to take into account all of the needs of the cluster. And those needs include having resources that are set aside as unused. Okay, in this cluster, this is a better prepared cluster. Okay, I have 3 hosts. All 3 hosts are running at 100% capacity. When one of those hosts fails, I have one host whose amount of resources is set aside as reserved, and so when this host fails, the virtual machines can easily go over to this host, again assuming that they're all the same size, and this host can process the needs of that VM. Very easy. This is one of the correct ways to create a cluster. Now, I will tell you, you don't have to set aside one host. You're not going to just say, okay, server 7 is our reserve. No, that's the clustering in vMotion or in DRS is far smarter than that, in H8 What it does is it takes all the resource reservations across all of these hosts and sort of adds them into a big equation. And then it chops them up and balances this reserve space across all the hosts in the cluster. There's no sense in unbalancing them and then leaving one reserved empty. No, why don't we just use, I don't know, 75, 75, 75, and 75% of those resources across those 4 hosts. And now I've got a really much better mechanism of balancing that load. So to start out with, we're going to create an HA cluster here. That HA cluster is going to have 3 nodes. The 3 nodes will be more or less similarly configured, at least enough for our purposes. But we're doing so that one node has the excess capacity in place, or the cluster contains one node's worth of excess capacity to support the failover needs in case I should lose a host. Got that? All right, let's begin. So back here in vc.company.pri, this environment should look a little bit different than what you saw in previous nuggets. You'll see now we have ESX1, 2, and ESX3, which I've built this. It's another host. It's got the same networking configuration down here, same 3 data stores, 2 switches, 1 VM kernel port group, or 1 VM port group, 3 VM kernel port groups for storage and management network. So same kind of thing, right? ESX1, ESX2, ESX3. And I put these together because doing a cluster, you almost have to have 3 hosts, because if you create a cluster with HA turned on, I have one host that does things and another host that's waiting for the other one to die. So it's kind of nice to have 3 hosts to play around with. The way that you begin this process of creating a cluster is by right-clicking and choosing New Cluster. Now we have to give it a name, our cluster. And we have to turn on the features that we want. Now these features you obviously have to be licensed for, and you have to have HA to use fault tolerance that we'll talk about a little bit later. Once you turn on these features, then you can then work within them, obviously, do some initial configurations associated with those features. When you first turn on DRS, a lot of administrators, this is the load balancing piece, a lot of administrators get